Amara stood at the towering gates of the Blackwood mansion, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. The imposing structure loomed before her, a symbol of everything she had lost and everything she was forced to do to survive. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her worn-out bag as she took a deep breath. This was not how she had envisioned her life, but fate had other plans. The gates slowly creaked open, as if the very house itself was reluctant to let her in. A cold breeze swept through the courtyard, and Amara felt a shiver run down her spine. The mansion was even grander than she had imagined. Massive stone pillars lined the entrance, and the garden was so meticulously maintained it felt like stepping into another world. She walked forward, her footsteps echoing ominously on the marble pathway until she reached the enormous oak doors. She knocked softly at first, hesitant, but there was no response. After a few moments, she tried again, this time louder. The door swung open abruptly, revealing a stern-faced butler who eyed her up and down with thinly veiled disdain. "You must be the new help," he said, his voice clipped. "Yes," Amara replied softly. "Amara Davis. I'm here for the position." The butler sniffed, clearly unimpressed. "Follow me." She stepped inside, and the interior of the house was even more lavish than she had imagined. Chandeliers glittered above her, expensive artwork adorned the walls, and the floors were polished to a shine. It felt cold, though. There was no warmth in the beauty, only stark luxury. The butler led her through several long corridors until they reached a grand staircase. "Wait here," he ordered brusquely before disappearing up the stairs. Amara stood in silence, her heart racing. She knew what kind of man Adrien Blackwood was. The world knew. The infamous billionaire playboy. He was wealthy beyond belief, arrogant, and had a reputation for being ruthless in both business and his personal life. His affairs with models and actresses were the stuff of tabloid fodder. Why he needed a live-in housekeeper was beyond her comprehension, but she had no choice. Her family's debt was overwhelming, and this job, though humiliating, was her only way to keep them afloat. The sound of approaching footsteps broke her thoughts. Amara straightened as a tall figure descended the staircase. Her breath hitched slightly as she took him in. Adrien Blackwood. He was more striking in person than the photos suggested. His dark hair was neatly styled, his tailored suit hugged his broad shoulders perfectly, and his face was sharp, all angles and arrogance. His piercing blue eyes locked onto hers, and she felt a jolt of something she couldn't quite place. He stopped a few feet from her, folding his arms across his chest. There was a tense silence as he sized her up, his gaze cold and impassive. "You're the new house help?" His voice was deep, and though the words were simple, they dripped with disdain. "Yes, sir," she answered, her voice barely above a whisper. She couldn't look him in the eyes for long. He was too intense, too overwhelming. Adrien raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a mocking smile. "You don't look like the usual type I hire for housekeeping." Amara's cheeks flushed, but she bit her tongue. She wasn't here to argue, no matter how degrading his words were. This was a job, a means to an end. "I'll work hard, sir," she replied, keeping her voice steady. He stepped closer, towering over her, his presence suffocating. "I hope you do. I don't tolerate incompetence. Fail to meet my expectations, and you'll be out of here before you can blink." "Understood." "Yes, sir." Adrien gave her a final, dismissive look before turning on his heel. "Joseph will show you to your quarters," he said over his shoulder before disappearing down another hallway. Amara exhaled, realizing she had been holding her breath. Her hands trembled slightly as the butler, Joseph, returned and beckoned her to follow him again. He led her down a narrow corridor on the far side of the mansion, away from the grandeur she had seen earlier. They stopped at a small room with a single bed, a tiny dresser, and a window that overlooked the back of the estate. It was modest, but it was more than she had expected. "This is where you'll stay," Joseph said, his tone neutral. "You'll start early tomorrow morning." The list of duties will be provided to you then. Good night." With that, he left her alone in the room. Amara sat down on the bed, her head spinning. The weight of her situation pressed heavily on her chest. She had no idea how long she would have to stay here, how long it would take to pay off her family's debt. But one thing was clear: Adrien Blackwood was not going to make it easy. The next morning, Amara rose early. Her list of tasks was overwhelming: cleaning, organizing, maintaining the sprawling estate. The work was hard and relentless, but she pushed through. Adrien was nowhere to be seen, and for that, she was thankful. However, as the day wore on, she began to feel his presence lingering in every room she entered, like a shadow she couldn't shake. By mid-afternoon, Amara was cleaning the library when she heard voices approaching. She froze, realizing it was Adrien and another man. They entered the room, and Amara immediately ducked behind one of the large bookcases, hoping not to be noticed. "You can't keep this up forever, Adrien," the man said, his voice casual. "You're going to have to settle down one day." Adrien scoffed. "Settle down? Not likely. Why would I tie myself to one woman when I can have them all?" The other man laughed, but there was an edge to Adrien's voice that made Amara frown. He sounded bitter. "Cold." "I don't need anyone complicating my life," Adrien continued. "People are only useful for as long as they serve a purpose." Amara's stomach twisted at his words. She felt a sudden surge of anger. Was that all people were to him? Tools to be used and discarded? The men moved further into the room, and Amara tried to inch away, hoping to escape unnoticed. But in her haste, her foot caught on a loose rug, and she stumbled forward, knocking over a stack of books. The noise echoed in the room, and both men turned sharply toward her. Adrien's eyes narrowed dangerously as he spotted her. "You," he growled, stepping forward. "What do you think you're doing?" Amara's heart pounded in her chest as she stood frozen, her mind racing. She had no explanation, only the certainty that she had just made a very dangerous enemy. Adrien advanced on her, his expression dark and unreadable. "Let's make one thing clear," he said, his voice low and menacing. "In this house, you don't eavesdrop. Ever." Amara braced herself for the worst, but what he said next was even more chilling. "If you want to stay, you'll learn your place, or I'll make sure you regret ever stepping foot in here." Amara's pulse raced as she stood under Adrien's piercing gaze. The tension in the room was suffocating, and for a moment, she thought she might crumble under the weight of his words. But she couldn't. No, she wouldn't let him intimidate her. She had faced worse than this. She straightened her spine and met his eyes, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to overhear," she said, choosing her words carefully. "I was just doing my job." Adrien's expression didn't soften in the slightest. If anything, his gaze grew colder, more calculating. "Your job is to be invisible, Miss Davis," he said, each word dripping with condescension. "Do you understand what that means?" Amara swallowed hard, nodding. "Yes, sir." "Good." He glanced at the other man, who had been watching the exchange with mild amusement. "Leave us," Adrien ordered, and the man quickly exited the room, leaving them alone. The silence that followed was oppressive. Adrien took a step closer, invading Amara's personal space, and she had to resist the urge to step back. She wouldn't show fear. Not to him. "Do you know what happens to people who cross me?" Adrien asked, his voice low and threatening. Amara's heart thudded in her chest, but she forced herself to hold his gaze. "No, sir." "They don't last long," he said, his eyes boring into hers as if trying to pry open her soul. "In this house, you do as you're told, or you're gone. I won't hesitate to throw you out if you become a problem. Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, sir," she whispered, the words bitter on her tongue. Adrien's eyes flicked over her face, searching for any sign of defiance, but Amara kept her expression neutral, her emotions locked tightly away. After what felt like an eternity, he finally stepped back, giving her room to breathe again. "Good," he said, turning away from her as if she were nothing more than a bothersome insect. "Now get out of my sight." Amara didn't need to be told twice. She hurried out of the library, her heart still pounding, and didn't stop until she reached the safety of her small room. She closed the door behind her, leaning against it as she tried to calm her racing thoughts. What had she gotten herself into? Adrien Blackwood was even more ruthless than she'd imagined. His words echoed in her mind, a stark reminder that she was on dangerous ground. One wrong move, and she could lose everything. But as the initial shock began to fade, another emotion took its place: anger. Who was he to treat her like this? Yes, she was his employee, but she wasn't a piece of property to be threatened and belittled. She was here to work off her family's debt, not to be his punching bag. Amara's resolve hardened. She wouldn't let Adrien intimidate her. She would do her job, keep her head down, and stay out of his way. But she wouldn't cower in fear. She couldn't afford to. The next few days were grueling. Adrien seemed determined to make her life as difficult as possible. He assigned her the most menial, back-breaking tasks, clearly expecting her to fail. Cleaning the massive chandeliers in the grand ballroom, polishing the marble floors until they gleamed, organizing his impossibly large wardrobe down to the last detail. No job was too small or too demanding. And yet, despite his best efforts, Amara didn't falter. She worked tirelessly from dawn until dusk, her hands raw and her muscles aching, but she refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her struggle. Every time she completed a task, she could almost feel his frustration, though he never acknowledged it. He watched her closely, his eyes tracking her every move, waiting for her to slip up. But Amara was determined not to give him the satisfaction. It wasn't just the physical demands that made the work difficult. Adrien's presence was oppressive, a constant reminder that she was under his thumb. He was always around, always watching, even when she couldn't see him. His icy gaze seemed to follow her everywhere, and she could never shake the feeling that he was waiting for her to make a mistake. One afternoon, while she was scrubbing the floors in the dining room, Adrien walked in, his footsteps echoing on the polished wood. Amara kept her head down, focusing on her work, but she could feel his eyes on her. The silence stretched on, heavy and uncomfortable, until finally he spoke. "You missed a spot." Amara looked up, her eyes narrowing slightly as she saw him pointing to a tiny smudge on the floor that she had somehow overlooked. It was barely noticeable, but Adrien's gaze was sharp, his expression almost smug as he pointed it out. "I'll fix it, sir," she said, her voice steady, though inside she was fuming. Adrien watched as she scrubbed the spot clean, a small, satisfied smirk playing on his lips. "You're not as thorough as I thought," he said, his tone mocking. Amara clenched her jaw, but didn't respond. She couldn't let him get under her skin. She finished the task, stood up, and met his gaze. "Is there anything else, sir?" Adrien's smirk faded, replaced by that cold, calculating expression she had come to loathe. "Don't let it happen again," he said curtly before turning and walking away. As soon as he was gone, Amara let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Every interaction with Adrien left her feeling like she was walking on a tightrope, with no safety net to catch her if she fell. But she couldn't let him break her, not when so much was at stake. Later that evening, after a long day of work, Amara was in the kitchen preparing a late meal for the staff when she overheard a conversation between two of the maids. They were gossiping, their voices low but filled with excitement. "Did you hear about the party Mr. Blackwood is throwing this weekend?" one of them said, her eyes wide with anticipation. "Yes. It's going to be the event of the season," the other maid replied. "All the elite will be there, and I heard Mr. Blackwood invited that supermodel he's been seeing." Amara's ears perked up at that. She had heard about Adrien's many flings, but this was the first time she had come face to face with the reality of it. The thought of him entertaining some glamorous woman while treating her like dirt made her stomach turn. "I don't know how he does it," the first maid continued. "He's so cold, but women flock to him like moths to a flame." "It's the power," the second maid said knowingly. "And the money. He's the most eligible bachelor in the city. Every woman wants to be the one to tame him." Amara bit her lip, her anger simmering just below the surface. So this was the kind of man Adrien Blackwood was, a playboy who used his wealth and power to manipulate those around him. But no matter how many women fell for his charms, she wouldn't be one of them. She couldn't afford to be. The weekend arrived, and the mansion was transformed for the party. Amara was tasked with overseeing the preparations, making sure everything was perfect for the guests who would soon fill the halls. The staff bustled around, setting up tables, arranging flowers, and ensuring that every detail was flawless. As the evening approached, Amara found herself caught in the whirlwind of last-minute preparations. The tension in the air was palpable, and she could sense the excitement of the other staff members. They were eager to see the city's elite, to catch a glimpse of the glamorous world that was so far removed from their own. But Amara wasn't interested in the guests. She was focused on keeping her head down and doing her job. She knew that Adrien would be watching, waiting for any excuse to criticize her work, and she was determined not to give him one. As the first guests began to arrive, Amara slipped into the background, blending in with the other servants. She kept her eyes on her work, avoiding the glances of the guests who barely noticed her presence. But it was impossible to ignore the buzz of excitement that filled the room when Adrien finally made his entrance. He was dressed in a sleek black suit, his hair perfectly styled, and his expression as cold and distant as ever. But there was something different about him tonight, something that made him even more intimidating. He moved through the crowd with ease, exchanging pleasantries with the guests, but his eyes were sharp, always scanning the room as if he were hunting for something. Amara couldn't help but watch him, despite herself. There was something magnetic about Adrien, something that drew people to him even when they knew they should stay away. She hated that she found him so fascinating, but there was no denying it. He was a man who commanded attention, whether he wanted it or not. As the night wore on, the party grew more lively. Music filled the air, and the guests began to dance and mingle, their laughter echoing through the grand halls. Amara continued to work, clearing plates and refilling drinks, trying her best to stay unnoticed. But she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. She glanced up and froze when she saw Adrien's eyes locked on her from across the room. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his gaze that sent a shiver down her spine. He didn't look away, didn't try to hide the fact that he was watching her, and it made her feel exposed in a way she hadn't felt before. Amara quickly looked away, focusing on her work, but she could still feel his eyes on her. It was as if he were trying to unravel her, to see what lay beneath the surface. She hated that he had this effect on her, that he could make her feel so vulnerable with just a look. The night dragged on, and Amara's exhaustion began to catch up with her. She was in the process of clearing a table when she heard a soft, feminine laugh behind her. She turned to see Adrien standing with a stunning woman, a supermodel, by the looks of her. The woman was clinging to his arm, her smile flirtatious, and her eyes filled with admiration. Adrien's attention was fully on the woman, his expression relaxed in a way Amara hadn't seen before. The sight of him being so charming, so different from the cold man she knew, sent a pang of something that felt uncomfortably like jealousy through her. She tried to shake it off, reminding herself that this was who Adrien Blackwood was, a playboy, a man who could have any woman he wanted. She was nothing to him, just a servant in his household, and it would be foolish to think otherwise. But even as she told herself that, she couldn't ignore the tightness in her chest, the way her stomach twisted when she saw the way the woman looked at him. It was irrational, she knew, but it was there all the same. Amara busied herself with her work, trying to push the thoughts from her mind, but they lingered, gnawing at her. She needed to stay focused, to remember why she was here. But as the night wore on, it became harder to ignore the growing tension inside her. As the party began to wind down and the guests started to leave, Amara was finally able to take a moment to herself. She stepped outside into the cool night air, leaning against the wall of the mansion as she took a deep breath. The night was quiet, the stars twinkling overhead, and for the first time that day, she felt a sense of peace. But it didn't last. The door behind her opened, and she turned to see Adrien stepping out, his expression unreadable. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at her with those intense blue eyes that seemed to see right through her. Amara's heart skipped a beat, and she quickly looked away, hoping he wouldn't notice the way her hands trembled slightly. She wasn't prepared for another confrontation, not after everything that had happened that day. But Adrien didn't seem to be in the mood for a fight. Instead, he stepped closer, his gaze never leaving her. "What are you doing out here?" he asked, his voice surprisingly soft. "I needed some air," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. He nodded, as if accepting her answer, but there was something in his eyes that made her uneasy. It was like he was searching for something in her, something he couldn't quite find. They stood there in silence for a few moments, the tension between them palpable. Amara didn't know what to say, and it seemed that Adrien was content to simply watch her, his gaze unnervingly intense. Finally, he broke the silence. "You did well tonight," he said, his tone neutral. Amara blinked in surprise. It was the closest thing to a compliment she had ever received from him. "Thank you," she replied cautiously. Adrien didn't respond, but his gaze softened just a fraction, and for a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of something almost human, behind his cold exterior. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the familiar arrogance that she had come to expect from him. "You should get some rest," he said, his voice firm again. "Tomorrow will be another long day." Amara nodded, grateful for the chance to escape the strange, unsettling encounter. She turned to leave, but before she could take more than a few steps, Adrien spoke again, his voice low and almost hesitant. "Miss Davis." She paused, glancing back at him. "Yes, sir?" Adrien's eyes locked onto hers, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw something vulnerable in his gaze. But then he blinked, and it was gone, replaced by his usual cold demeanor. "Good night," he said, his tone final. Amara hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to make of the strange interaction, but she finally nodded and whispered, "Good night, sir," before turning and walking back into the mansion. As she made her way to her room, her mind raced with questions. What was that about? Why had Adrien suddenly been so different? And why couldn't she shake the feeling that there was more to him than met the eye? But as much as she wanted answers, she knew better than to dwell on it. Adrien Blackwood was a man full of secrets, and the last thing she needed was to get caught up in whatever was lurking beneath the surface. As she reached her room and closed the door behind her, Amara leaned against it, her heart still pounding. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between them tonight, something that could complicate everything. Little did she know, Adrien was standing just outside her door, his hand hovering over the doorknob, as if he were debating whether to knock. But after a moment, he let his hand fall to his side and walked away, leaving Amara alone with her thoughts and the growing sense of unease.